just like politics, all news is local, and that's certainly the case on Idaho Matters, the weekday public affairs podcast from Boise State Public Radio. Listen today to hear about events and issues that impact Idahoans. Search Idaho Matters wherever you get your podcasts. From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. A Republican-led House committee that investigated the COVID-19 pandemic here in the United States released its final report Monday. The committee wrote it hoped the work would serve as a roadmap for Congress, the executive branch, and the private sector to be able to prepare for and respond to future pandemics. So joining us today to talk more about this report is Dr. David Pate. He is the former CEO of St. Luke's Health System. He's also the co-author of the book, Preparing for the Next Global Outbreak. Hi, Dr. Pate.
Hi, Gemma.
Now, folks, remember, if you have a public health question, send us an email, idahomatters@boisestate.edu. So, Dr. Pate, let's begin with you just explaining to us what this subcommittee did, because this was a 2-year investigation, I believe.
Yes, you're right. This was a 2-year process of a House committee that the majority was Republicans investigating the coronavirus pandemic. And so this is their final report. And while I think there is much for me to object to in terms of their scientific conclusions, and that probably has a lot to do with the selection of witnesses that they brought before the committee. But what I'm actually thrilled about is some very important issues that don't get enough discussion they brought out. And these are policy issues, so they shouldn't be as political. So I think there's some really good things in here, even though I would still object to a lot of the report.
So let's talk about one of the things that you've talked about on this program, and this is our strategic national stockpile. So for folks who might not remember what that is, first explain what this stockpile is.
So this stockpile is the result of legislation in 1999 as part of our pandemic, as part of the U.S. emergency response. It's actually a matter of debate in this report as to whether this strategic national stockpile is intended for a pandemic or not. There's actually some conflicting statements in the report. But basically, the strategic national stockpile primarily focused in the past on having smallpox vaccine, which we have eliminated smallpox. So the only way we would see that is as a warfare or bioterrorism event. But it has smallpox vaccines, and then also anthrax was another big focus. However, these are about 12 different stockpiles in secret locations that are not made public throughout the United States. And at least to my efforts, you cannot find out what is the stock of materials in it. What our rude awakening was, as everybody will remember when they flash back to 2020, is that while people like me who have run hospitals and health systems have always felt a little bit of safety in knowing that the stockpiles would be there and have whatever we needed, it was a real wake-up call to find out there wasn't that much in the strategic national stockpiles. And so we didn't have enough PPE, we didn't have enough ventilators, and many other supplies that were needed. And I was really happy to see this subcommittee acknowledge that and propose some statements going forward for what should be done differently.
Okay, so talk about some of those proposals, Dr. Pate, because I vividly remember in particular when the pandemic, came east to west, right? And we saw, like in New York City in particular, nurses, doctors literally wearing garbage bags to go in and help these patients with COVID. And you're sitting there thinking, well, if it's only on the East Coast and we know it's coming this way and they're wearing garbage bags, where are we going to be?
Well, exactly right. And in fact, what we experienced back then was shortages across the country, and the federal government telling states and even hospitals and health systems that everybody should just kind of fend for themselves. And of course, what the result was is you had negotiations going on internationally to purchase supplies where you, as a state or a hospital or a health system, you have to make competing bids against the federal government. And so
Oh,
we often lost that. And yet the federal government was saying it's not actually our job to get you all these supplies that you need. So I was really happy that this subcommittee acknowledged this was an issue. I don't know that their response to that is the best response, but I did address it in the book when I wrote and said that it is just going to be a matter that we can't count on the federal strategic stockpiles. So I do think states need to consider having their own stockpiles. And this committee comes out and expressly says that states should develop their own stockpiles. That will be a challenge. One of the hardest things about a stockpile is first of all, you're not knowing what you're going to need in the future. And second, as you purchase things to have in that stockpile, if that emergency doesn't materialize before the expiration date, you're throwing out a lot of things. So
mm,
I had suggested a couple years ago to the state of Idaho that this actually is something we should do, and do it in partnership with the health systems of the state, because the state can purchase the supplies, the health systems can buy them from the state, and we can keep rotating that stock all the while the state does have an emergency supply. So that might be one approach to make it cost effective.
and did the state do that?
No, maybe. I'm humbled every day, Gemma. That there's lots of people and folks that don't follow my advice, but that's how it is. But perhaps this report might
Right.
motivate a few states to do that. So we'll wait and see what the response is. I still think it would be a good idea.
Well, because my understanding, Dr. Payton, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that in the report, I mean, they did say in the report that if we have an insecure supply chain, that there's then a bigger risk to a future failed pandemic response.
Absolutely. And this was the other part that I was just so thrilled to see in their report. I think it was great. I was afraid that we would have short memories, but the committee did point out that our unsecure supply chain is actually a national security threat. And I couldn't agree more. And Gemma, over the years that we've been doing this show together, how many times have you asked me about various drug shortages,
Hmm.
even after 2020, when there was,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. So, and what they point out in the report, which is exactly right, and I was so glad to see them make this comment, is that we are overly dependent. And it's not just on the rest of the world. It's generally one country, and that country is China. Well, if most people will not remember, but in 2020, we had already been in a bit of, I don't know if the proper term would be a trade war with China, but certainly President Trump had implemented some tariffs against them. Fortunately, that was all resolved. I think it was just days or weeks before the pandemic began. And thank God, because we are very dependent on China. If you look at the global supply of PPE, protective medical equipment, it is generally from the Hubei province of China. Guess what's in that province? Wuhan, exactly
Hmm.
where this outbreak was. And so, if that's where your factories are and that's where all these supplies are coming, but they've got a pandemic and they're locking down, or people that are sick and you can't run the factories, the whole world's going to suffer. And certainly we did. But, for example, 95% of ibuprofen, like Advil, that kind of stuff, the
Right.
ingredients, they come from China. 70% of the ingredients for Tylenol. 91% of the ingredients for hydrocortisone, a steroid that we need. 40% of the ingredients for penicillin come from there. So we're overly dependent. And the committee points out that we have to have the flex. We either need to have some of the production here in the United States that we can count on, or we have to have systems in place that we can rapidly convert existing production lines to these products, as we did in some cases, for example, like with ventilators when we were in shortage.
Were you surprised by this recommendation and by this committee? I mean, literally saying we need a better supply chain, or we will face, these exact same issues when and if another pandemic strikes.
Yes and no. I was pleasantly surprised, but on the other hand, I wasn't shocked because this really should be a nonpartisan issue. And I suspect that when hospitals and health systems and patients couldn't get medicines, couldn't get supplies that they needed, all of those representatives' offices, whether Republican or Democrat, were flooded with calls and emails and letters. So I was pleased to see it, but not shocked. But nevertheless, I want to give the committee lots of credit for this.
So the other thing they talk about, that they write about in this final report, is COVID testing. And they acknowledge that their early CDC tests were flawed. Can you talk a little bit about that first?
Yes, this was a huge issue. And in fact, I'd spent a lot of time writing about this in my book. And what happened was that when we have a situation like this with a novel virus, that means a virus that we haven't known about or seen before, and the population doesn't have immunity. So the only way we can know whether people have that infection is we got to have tests. And under the current rules that were in place at that time, the CDC was the one to develop the test. Now, that's the CDC obviously is critical to doing this, but that's actually not their forte, at least not in terms of producing and distributing tests. And so what happened was the CDC did develop a test, but when there was a flaw in that test. And I think people will remember back to the early part of 2020, first half of the year, where you could go in to get a test and it might take a week to get your test back or longer. And it certainly was longer initially. And sometimes people were well before the test even came back. And so there wasn't a way to really isolate or quarantine people or whatever. But there was a problem with the rollout of this test, particularly relating to a reagent. So the CDC had to call all those back. And at that time, the only thing you could do is send samples to the CDC, which is that you're sending them to Atlanta, which is a really cumbersome process. So what ended up saving the day was finally the FDA and CDC cleared the way that academic laboratories and large commercial laboratories could produce tests. They could make tests and produce them. This FDA would have to verify their accuracy, but they could do that. That really then accelerated us getting tests. And in fact, that's the reason we have rapid tests today, where you can buy them and do them at home. That's because of commercial labs developing that. So this committee very, very rightly points out, I think, that in the future, we need these private-public partnerships. Instead of just relying on the CDC and having that single point of potential failure, let's include, now not, people that don't know what they're doing, but, these large commercial labs, academic labs, they're very technical, very experienced. Partner with them, we can do things much quicker and respond. And it's a perfect recommendation. I totally agree.
Another issue that was brought up in this final report, this was travel restrictions. And they literally come out and say travel restrictions save lives. So, Dr. Pate, talk about this, because in the report, they talk about rapidly implemented travel restrictions, which, I mean, we're going on 5 years, but my husband was actually on the East Coast traveling for a conference when restrictions started being put in place. And I remember literally changing his ticket to a day early to come home because I was like, I don't know if you're going to be able to get back here because travel restrictions were being put in place so quickly.
Yes. So quickly, but not quick enough, actually.
Right.
So I write about this at length in the book, too. This is a very controversial issue about whether travel restrictions are actually going to work. And the issue is by the time you realize that you've got this outbreak and you start to put a travel ban in place, so if you think back to then in 2020, when the ban was implemented, it was actually 3 international airports is where we were doing screening of people. And it was a ban on people that lived in the area initially, the people that lived in the area where the outbreak was. But if you were an American returning from the very same place, it didn't impact you and you didn't have to go through the screening and stuff. Well, that's a failure to realize it doesn't matter what your nationality is as to whether you can get infected if you're in the area of the virus. So it's leaky. The second thing is, can you actually implement it by the time you know what to look for? Can you implement it fast enough? And back then, when we implemented the travel restrictions, one of the things they were doing at those 3 international airports was they were just screening people. Do you have fever? Do you have symptoms? Well, as we came to later understand, a few months later, 40% of people were asymptomatic, or they could still be in the incubation period and not yet infectious, but get home and a couple or several days later become infectious, and you would miss it if you're looking for fever. So there's a lot of problems, but if they're done quickly, if you know what to look for, and especially if we could have some kind of a test, then it does make sense. There's a number of countries that did do automatic quarantines of people coming to their country. So it didn't matter if you were coming in. They picked you up at the airport and they took you to a hotel or they took you to a military facility, and you had to stay there until you went past the incubation period and they knew you weren't infected. And of course, we do know that worked. This one is leaky. Our first case that we recognized, the case from Washington, our nearby state, that person came back to the United States. First of all, he was an American. And second, he came back to the United States a couple of days before the restrictions went in place. And like you said, you reacted with your husband traveling, and that's because we announce it, and I think we have to by regulations. So we say we're going to put a travel restriction in place. It's going to go in effect in 3 days. Well, if you need to get back to the United States and you might be exposed, you're just going to jump on a plane and come on back. So it's just the way we do it. It's not perfect, but they do come to the conclusion. I think it is supportable. It did help buy us some time. Every case that you delayed or prevented from coming in initially gave us fewer contacts, less transmission. It probably helped us to have a little time to get ahead of this thing, to figure out what are we dealing with, how do we test for it, what are the symptoms, and it could be very important in an illness that might be causing hospital strain if people are getting extremely ill. To be able to block some of these cases in would help us adjust to be able to handle that. So there's a role, but we have to realize it's very limited and we probably should do them differently.
I have a little bit less than 2 minutes left with you, Dr. Pate. I want to talk about what they say about the success of Operation Warp Speed. This was getting vaccines out quickly.
It was. This was really, in my mind, the same analogy to President Kennedy's moonshot. Operation Warp Speed, we've never seen anything like that before. It was an amazing success of science. And credit goes to President Trump for that. It was his administration doing this. It's a little unfortunate that now he can't really take credit for it because so much of the base is anti-vaccines, but it was a tremendous success, and it shows what we could do. And of course, if we face another pandemic, and remember, as I've told listeners many times, the next one could be far worse. This is what we just went through is not the worst possible scenario. We will be very dependent on quick production of what safe and effective vaccines, and that's exactly what happened with Operation Warp Speed, a tremendous success.
Well, Dr. Pate, as always, appreciate your time with us today, in particular, breaking down this final report, especially as you've said, it is not if we see another pandemic, but when we see another pandemic, and hopefully the response will be even better the next time. With that said, a big thank you to Dr. David Pate. He is the former CEO of St. Luke's Health System, also the co-author of the book, Preparing for the Next Global Outbreak. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.